Hello, I am Anavultus, and this video is a response to a video by Matt Christiansen that is What's Natural About Natural Rights, an important debate on which listeners challenge me. So I ended up disagreeing with Matt Christiansen's opinion in this video, and I wanted to make a response to it indicating my particular viewpoint on this. Now let me be very clear here. I don't know a lot about Matt Christiansen, but I also will say that I respect his straightforward opinion on this, and I do not wish any ill towards him. So if anybody is assuming that this is some form of attack, that is incorrect.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That, of course, is the famous second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. It's a concept that's at the core, the very foundation of American society and government. The idea that your rights are inherently yours, that they pre-exist government, thus they aren't created by or given by government. They were always there, and government is built to secure them. Rights establish government. Government does not establish rights. That is the framework upon which our entire founding and constitution are built. Still, this idea is frequently challenged in my email inbox and in my Twitter mentions. These are people arguing, hey, that all sounds great, but it's nothing more than flowery language. The reality is that your rights are in fact a social construct. Humans invent them, humans codify them. Your rights only exist as long as humans agree about them and decide to protect them. In short, there are those of you arguing that there's nothing natural about natural rights at all. They are, in fact, unnatural human creations.
Now, Matt Christiansen begins by quoting a part of the Declaration of Independence, and then begins to make the main contrast between the two positions. That is, his position, which he believes to be in line with Thomas Jefferson's idea on natural rights and natural law, as opposed to a moral relativist, social constructivist position on the other side. Now, I want to be very clear that I personally do not come from a social constructivist position, at least not in my fundamental morals on this. If you want to have a greater discussion of my particular morals, I've made a video called The Imperial Ethic, and that's something that would be useful. But I particularly want to emphasize that the social constructivist perspective is not the only perspective that is contrary to the idea of natural rights and natural law. In fact, one idea that is commonly used that is contrary to that is the idea of a divine command theory, which the early thinkers on natural rights and natural law incorporated as their idea and used to legitimize their idea, as is defined in, let's say, the Declaration of Independence, with the phrase of endowed by their creator. And Thomas Jefferson didn't put that in there simply in order to make it sound better, but to actually call back to philosophical ideas that had been established centuries before in the reasoning from which natural rights are derived. But I'm not actually going to get into that reasoning until later on, when there's a more appropriate time in this video to address that.
Yeah, this video is going to be sort of fart-sniffy philosophy, but understand, I'm not making this video for the sniffs. I'm not making this video so we can all congratulate each other on what impressive intellectuals we are. I'm making this video for the incredible importance of getting the answer to this question right. This debate is so fundamental not only to our country, but to the concepts of human rights and human liberty generally, so it's wise to take some time to explain the concept in detail. Why exactly are your natural rights yours and not society's? And what's so natural about them? Where in nature do they supposedly come from? And how can natural rights possibly be objectively defined? Those are all fair questions, and to those of you arguing the other side of this one, I can see why that language in the Declaration might not be satisfactory. We hold these truths to be self-evident, delivered by a creator. That sort of argument isn't usually satisfying to a curious mind. It sounds more poetic than it does explanatory. Why are these truths self-evident? And how do we know that the origin is a creator? In Jefferson's defense, he was building a country, not necessarily writing new philosophy. The foundation was already laid by thinkers before him. He was simply building upon it. And hey, it's hard to dispute the success of that construction. The Declaration did what it was supposed to do.
Now, Matt Christiansen makes a very good point in that these issues are fundamental to the founding of the United States and also are fundamental to the idea of human rights in general. That without this idea of natural rights that are specifically defined as understood by the founding fathers, that you don't have the impetus for the independence of the United States in the first place. Additionally, you also do not have a strong foundation for human rights, at least as independent from any, let's say, divine revelation epistemic system. Furthermore, how these ideas play out do not only affect how governments are formed and how countries interact with each other on questions of human rights, but also deal with the day-to-day lives of people and how they should treat each other. So I agree with Matt Christiansen that getting these questions right and getting the answers to these questions right is very, very important. And that's why for centuries and perhaps even thousands of years, these are things that have been debated very hotly by philosophers, not in a merely fart-sniffing way, but in a very serious sense.
In my view, the case for natural rights is best broken down into two segments, two separate but interrelated arguments. The first is the objective truth of it, the natural origin of your natural rights. And the second is the consequences for ignoring that truth. So let's get into it.
Matt Christiansen, of course, makes two arguments, the first one being an objective argument, which I'm very interested in hearing, because that is something that is always very important. However, the second one is actually irrelevant. Now, why is an appeal to the consequence irrelevant in this instance? Why is the argumentum ad consequentiam irrelevant? Well, the answer is because if you are making a moral argument, actually an argument in favor of a particular system of morality, then if you have not already established the system of morality, then you cannot argue that any consequences of applying or not applying that system are good or bad, because that would require you to refer back to the system in itself, which means that the second argument is completely irrelevant if the first argument is false. Now, I'm not saying outright right now that the first argument is false, but I am saying that the second argument is not an independent argument to the first argument, which means that if you disagreed with the first argument, but you agreed with the second argument, then you are being logically inconsistent.
What I think a lot of people find dissatisfying about that self-evident truth and endowed by a creator language is it doesn't necessarily give you a traceable path to the origin of your so-called natural rights. It sounds like you're just supposed to take it as true, almost as a matter of faith. In this context, though, endowed by a creator could also be phrased as existing in nature. Natural rights have an objective, observable basis in nature. They are inherent to nature, not simply invented and attributed to it. This is John Locke's basic thinking that was heavily influential on our founders. Consider what we call a state of nature. Humans existing in a world free from government, free from organized society, the total anarchy of the unsettled wild. In such a place, what is it that guides us? What is it that we're driven to do? What is our purpose with only the forces of nature acting upon us? Nothing but survival, nothing but self-preservation, nothing but living to see tomorrow while we make more of us through the night. That natural drive for the preservation and the construction of your life and your property, that is what we call natural law. Nobody put you up to that purpose. You didn't decide on that purpose. It is innately within you. It's an inherent natural part of being a human being. And so it follows that any person violating that purpose, robbing you of the pursuit of your life or property, is violating natural law. That is a violation of the natural rights you are exercising according to that natural drive within you. That's why we call these natural rights. These are what humans are driven to do before societies or governments ever exist. Accordingly, it is wise to build a government that exists to recognize and secure human nature, not a government that exists to mold humans into some sort of subjective perfection.
Now, it is at this point that I believe that Matt Christiansen makes a fundamental error in his reasoning. Now, I'm not saying this against him as a person. I'm not saying that he reasoned incorrectly within the knowledge that he had, but what I am saying is that he was accidentally thinking very much inside of a particular box. Now, and he also misrepresented the ideas of John Locke. Now, he correctly formulated the idea of these rights being endowed by the Creator as a core element of the idea of natural law and natural rights. And why is it a core element? Because it is actually not a core element of John Locke's argument that nature itself, by itself, can simply be used as a derivation point for natural rights, but John Locke begins by talking about the Creator, and as the Creator having created everything, therefore being the owner of everything, then can give stewardship of things to man, therefore giving man the ability of having property. In other words, John Locke's argument is predicated on the idea of there being a creator. Same thing with Thomas Aquinas, also known for his ideas on natural law and natural rights. While John Locke and Thomas Aquinas, being influenced by the Aristotelian school, came to view things as having to be reasonably consistent and logically consistent, they still viewed it all within the context of a Christian worldview, that is to say, that there would be a creator, because otherwise it all would be irrelevant from the point of view of John Locke and of Thomas Aquinas. Same thing with Thomas Jefferson. Although Thomas Jefferson was certainly not as orthodox as Thomas Aquinas, for example, Thomas Jefferson still had a viewpoint of Unitarianism, and therefore believed that there was a God, and that therefore the existence of God is what these things could be reasoned from. However, these philosophers did not exist in a vacuum, because they were indeed opposed both at different times and in their own times by various other philosophers. For example, Augustine of Hippo, being very important in the formulation of divine command theory, which in some ways is similar to the idea of natural rights, but except with nature being removed as the middleman of the situation. And additionally, John Calvin also had a similar idea of divine command. And this idea of divine command is, of course, predicated on the idea of divine revelation, otherwise, without which divine command could be useless. However, then you might ask, why did they not agree necessarily with John Locke and with Thomas Aquinas that revelation is necessarily, at least of the morals, can be fully derived from nature? Well, the problem is that in Augustinian and in Calvinistic theology, there is an understanding of nature itself, particularly of the human nature, having been corrupted. Therefore, the fundamental argument that is required for natural rights to be true, that is to say, that nature in itself is right and that nature in itself is good, is incorrect. Because although both sides would agree that in the original state, the Creator created a good creation, the Augustinians and the Calvinists say that that creation has been corrupted, and that therefore nature in itself cannot be considered to be fundamentally good, which means that if nature is not good, then natural rights cannot be derived from natural law, because natural law would require you to essentially use a crooked measuring stick in order to create things that you would consider to be right, as opposed to having a straight measuring stick of divine revelation and divine command. So in that sense, that is where John Locke's argument falls apart. It falls apart in that nature in itself cannot be considered to be good by itself. Now, of course, you might say, well, is nature good? And to that I answer that it is not. And I can say that not only from a perspective of divine revelation, as Thomas Aquinas might find interesting, but also from a perspective of personal experience and also from historical analysis. That I agree with Thomas Hobbes, who, without putting in the idea of divine command and divine revelation, came to the conclusion, bellum omnium contra omnes. What does that mean? It means a war of all against all. In other words, that in the state of nature, man is in conflict, and that in the state of nature, man may very well overcome his compassion and his empathy for other men if it is for his own benefit. In other words, this idea of rights being applied to men equally, therefore allowing for a peaceful society to exist, is something that does not exist in an anarchic state, where individuals would be at odds against each other, just like the wild beasts are at odds against each other in nature, killing each other, raping each other, and taking food from each other. So I say that from an objective standpoint, from observational science, from a standpoint of theology, and from a standpoint of historical analysis, that natural rights are not coherent, because nature in itself is not good and therefore is unsuitable for rights to be based upon it.
Let me be clear that I don't think the argument that a certain idea is dangerous is sufficient in and of itself. I care, and we all should care, about the truth first and foremost, not the potential negative consequences of the truth. The truth is always worth seeking, and we'll clean up the mess later. But the truth leads to prosperity far more than it leads to suffering. That's exactly why I believe the concept of natural rights is so strongly associated with prosperous society. It's successful because it's true. I hope I convinced you of that in the prior segment. Maybe not, though. Maybe you still think it's all just poetic fluff and your rights really are nothing more than subjective social creations we all just decide and agree upon. There are significant consequences for operating under that theory, though. Consider the implications of that premise, that you have no rights that are inherent to you, only government permission slips, whether these rights are decided by a king's decree or a democratic majority vote. You get the freedom that they say you get, and that's all you're entitled to. Under this framework, your rights are the property of society. Society created them, society owns them, and society can take them away. And there's no inherent injustice in stripping those rights. They were never yours in the first place. If I let you borrow my car indefinitely, I can take that car back whenever I like, on whatever terms I like. And there's no inherent injustice in doing that because it's my property. Under this framework, the same is true for every right that you have, up to and including your life itself. Your very right to life is the property of society, and you just have to hope that society manages its property nicely, and you have no recourse if they don't, since it isn't your property anyway. If society decides to toss its property to the bottom of the dumpster, that's society's decision, and they're within their rights.
Now, I agree largely with Matt Christiansen's reasoning in this segment, because he correctly surmises that if nature is not the standard by which we base our rights, then our rights, if it is not nature or reason or the natural universe, it has to be something different and something that is outside of the realm of logic or the realm of nature. That is to say, that rights are artifices and that they are commanded by a structure of authority. Now, that being said, this is not entirely mutually exclusive with the ideas of the early natural rights philosophers themselves, because, as I mentioned previously, they all believed in an omnipotent God, and their systems were predicated on the idea that these rights were given to man by this God and were then understood by means of man's interaction with nature. But, of course, the divine command theory simply removes the middleman from this situation. But I would have to say that this is something that is actually consistent with observed reality, because if nature in itself were the establishing order of rights, then the courts themselves would be appointed by nature, then the executors would be appointed by nature, and it seems that this is not actually what happens. Because what actually happens is that the courts and the executors are established by systems of authority. Now, from a theological perspective, there is the idea held by both sides of the issue, at least of the issue as the issue was being discussed in the 1600s and the 1700s, that there is an almighty God judging everyone, who then himself justifies natural rights from the natural rights perspective. Now, from a temporal perspective, that is to say, in our lives on this world, these authorities that actually establish the courts and implement justice are known as states. Now, not necessarily in the sense of the United States, however, understood in a similar way, as in the United States of America would be a state and therefore would be a sovereign entity in this world that establishes justice and by means of its authority, which it holds by means of its power, which is exemplified by its ability to hold the monopoly of violence within its own territory or jurisdiction. In fact, this idea that governments are legitimate by the authority that they have is used very frequently to justify the divine right of kings, and also is very consistent with an orthodox interpretation of the epistles of a Christian New Testament, as exemplified in the understanding of John Jewel in his An Homily Against Disobedience and Willful Rebellion. And ultimately, this means that different societies will end up implementing different rights in how they are run. And that also contradicts Thomas Jefferson's idea that these things are self evident, because to many individuals around the world, these things are not self evident.
The consequences don't just impact our relationship with government, they impact our relationships with each other as well. If I observe natural law and deduce from it that you have a right to your life and your property that I would be wrong to infringe upon, that's an objective moral framework through which you and I can operate successfully. There's a right way for me to treat you, and there's a wrong way for me to treat you, and we've arrived at that conclusion based on what is observably true in nature, not based on any one random person's feelings spitballed at the wall. It's a structure that says nature determines right and wrong. Humans don't simply create it.
And again, Matt Christiansen contradicts the founders of the schools on natural rights and natural law in how he formulates this argument, because he formulates it as if it is something that is independent of the opinion and the ideas of anyone, which, of course, from the perspective of Thomas Aquinas and of John Locke and of Thomas Jefferson, would delegitimize this idea by removing the actual originator of nature himself, the Almighty God, therefore rendering it an argument from nature alone, and nature alone has no moral value by itself, because nature alone cannot be justified in itself without having something greater as a moral agent acting upon it.
If instead we operate under the idea that humans create right and wrong, then it's simply human agreement that defines morality. There is no inherent rightness or wrongness in how I choose to treat you. It just depends on who agrees with me. If I murder you and the king is on my side, there's no inherent wrong committed. If I murder you and 51% of people don't have a problem with it, there's no inherent wrong committed. That's a recipe for moral relativism, where what's right here today is wrong over there tomorrow, not based on anything observably true about the world, just based on the feelings of the person who's in position to decide at the time. That is chaos. That's injustice. That's atrocity. That's suffering.
Now, Matt Christiansen goes further to say that if these morals and if these rights can simply be determined by someone's opinion, then that is chaos, and that does not lead to something that is good. But of course, Matt Christiansen is, of course, presuming that his particular system of right and wrong are correct, because he assumed the idea that if you murder someone and the king is okay with it, then that is okay. But of course, murder in itself is an unjustifiable killing. But what about capital punishment? If you kill someone and the king is okay with it, is that not something that would be a capital punishment? Or hypothetically, let's go one step beyond. What if it is a divine command in itself, which then goes back to this idea of natural rights? Because I think what Matt Christiansen is missing is that he himself is the one that is advocating for chaos here, because he himself, by placing nature in itself as the standard of morals, rather than placing nature as a means for transmission of morals, is indeed removing any objectivity that rights could possibly have. Why? Because what this means is that your analysis of nature and how that comes out is going to determine what you consider to be right and wrong. And unfortunately for Matt Christiansen, this analysis is not the same for everyone. As I have demonstrated earlier when I talked about the wild beasts killing each other, raping each other, and stealing each other's food. That is very natural in nature. And that from an Augustinian perspective, following nature to its fullest extent would actually lead you to your own destruction. So, in that sense, nature in itself is not something that can consistently produce a system of ethics by itself. And the only reason why the natural rights philosophers could create a consistent system of ethics was because they, as an axiom presupposing nature, had the idea of an almighty God. Now, I am not making an argument that people should believe in God. That is not the argument that I am making, although that is one of my positions that I do hold. But the argument is rather that by removing one of the core elements of natural rights and natural law philosophy, Matt Christiansen actually undermines the entire integrity of the system. Because if there is no God behind it to justify nature, then nature in itself cannot be just, because nature has no means of enforcing itself upon others, as we see very clearly in the artifice of civilization and the frequency by which humans themselves commit genocide, murder, rape, and all sorts of other things that natural rights philosophers would consider to be bad things, but without having a God, they cannot actually justify these things as being bad, because these things all happen in nature.
In closing, let's expand upon that concept with a hypothetical. Let's say there are two neighboring states, one normal state in which cold-blooded murder is criminalized, and another weird state in which cold-blooded murder is perfectly legal and culturally nobody really has a problem with it. Murder away. It's like Las Vegas for killers. Is murder morally wrong in the first state, but morally right in the second? Is it merely the human creation of laws and cultural norms that makes that decision? Or is murder inherently wrong in both states? It's just a question of whether the humans there choose to acknowledge that objective reality. If you believe that it's inherently wrong in both places, regardless of whatever the people there say, that is a natural law position. It's not that people just got together and decided that murder is wrong. It's that murder fundamentally violates your purpose as a human being. That's why it's wrong. Not because any particular group of humans says so, but because it's contrary to nature. That's why our country is built the way it is. And that's why it's so crucial to start with nature and build government upon it, not start with government and try to rebuild nature from there.
Now, of course, I disagree with how Matt Christiansen characterizes the killing that occurs in the one state, because if, hypothetically, there is no higher authority to enforce upon those individuals a higher standard, that means that their killing is justified in their own situation, which means that it categorically cannot be murder. Now, that being said, the reason why I disagree with the moral relativists that therefore anything is allowable is because I do believe that there is a higher authority, that is to say, an almighty God above everything. But I will posit the idea that if there is no higher authority, then therefore there is no higher justice, and therefore there are no higher rights and there are no higher laws. Because even if you purport that there might be some form of authority, if that authority has no means of implementing its justice and has no courts of its own and has no executors of its justice, then it is useless and therefore does not function as an actual system of justice, and therefore is pointless, as I say to the proponents of natural law, that natural law cannot be justified from nature in itself, but requires the pre-existent justification of a different moral order. And in the case of Thomas Aquinas and John Locke, that would be the divine command. Now, in my particular case, it is the idea of what I call the imperial ethic, which is consistent with a divine command, but also allows for governments to also be considered authorities, although authorities that are inferior to the higher authority. So ultimately, this idea of natural law is incoherent. And what drives this point home even further is that Matt Christiansen talks about human purpose. But the question is, what is the purpose of humans? And how do we find this? Because if humans themselves have not been purposed in the first place, then human purpose is something that does not exist outside of a human social construct. Therefore, to say that it is a human purpose to live and to prosper is not an accurate statement, because what if you as a human decided to purpose your own life for destruction, and that destruction brought you great pleasure and you got away with it? Then ultimately it would make sense that this idea of human purpose is not one that is consistent with the idea of natural laws. I apologize a bit because my throat is actually drying out a little bit.
I hope this video explained these concepts in an understandable way, and I gotta say thank you to those of you who challenged me on it. You've demonstrated exactly why no idea should be shielded from criticism or challenge. My mind hasn't changed on this topic, but thanks to you, my perspective on it has really sharpened, and that outcome is just as valuable as changing minds. Natural rights and objective right and wrong are often difficult, amorphous concepts we sort of know to be true at a gut level, even if we can't explain them very well. This was a great exercise in explaining them. Not only is it a good feeling to know exactly why you believe what you believe, I think it's actually an obligation for any intellectually honest person. So thanks for holding me to that standard. And of course, any rebuttals from you moral relativist degenerates out there are always welcome.
Well, there you have it. That's all the major points of the video. I have responded to as many as I thought would be interesting for me to respond to, and I'm very thankful for Matt Christiansen for opening the avenue for debate on this issue, as it is an issue that I address very frequently on my channel in some respects, and is very closely related to a debate that I will shortly be having with John from the Generational Gap. So I thank you very much, Matt Christiansen, and also for my dear viewers. And if Matt Christiansen himself would like to have a discussion with me on this issue or on any other issue, or just to have a nice talk, I think that would be very fun and enjoyable. So thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time. Anavultus, over and out. Wait, just more thing. One more thing. If you cannot justify nature, then nature cannot justify you. That's my quote of the day. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time. Anavultus, over and out.